What is financial crime? Well, clearly, these are illicit acts, criminal acts involving money. The easiest way to describe it is fraud. Honestly, most people understand or think they understand what fraud is, so let's define it very quickly. It's really any misrepresentation in order to gain financially. So, getting money by fooling people or stealing it. You can steal a check, you can cash it and pretend it's yours, you can change the dollar amount. That is a version of fraud. You can pretend to be someone's long lost love, boyfriend or girlfriend on the internet. Any sort of scams like that are a category of fraud, right? I'm some prince from a foreign country who just needs to get his fortune out of customs. Even like, oh, your granddaughter is in prison and she needs bail money to get out of a Turkish prison. That can be one of those things. So, medical billing, you see up there, there's a way to separate procedures and bill people for, cutting the skin open and then removing a bad thing and then sewing the skin back up instead of just one surgery. It's called unbundling. In the business world, it's called unbundling. I don't know what they call it in fraud. Anyway, this can also be done in construction. Think about using promising 3/4 inch plywood and then using only 1/2 inch plywood. Okay, this is a downgrade in materials when you charged for one and gave a different. All right, any type of fraud is very broad. Any type of thing here where you say one thing and do another and get extra money because of it is fraud. Okay. And by the way, it's a great way to segue into money laundering because money laundering requires some kind of a predicate crime. In the law, they call it a specified unlawful activity. That's SUA. Okay, that's the US criminal code, involves a whole bunch of different crimes like drug sales, human trafficking, even prostitution, and fraud. That when you do these crimes and you earn money, anything you do with that money is now considered laundering. It's a secondary crime and it allows prosecutors to find multiple ways to get you and hold you responsible for your illicit acts. Now, classically, we've thought of money laundering in three phases, and it's a useful paradigm, although I think it's changing quite a bit. Placement involves taking physical currency, usually, and moving it into the banking system. Now, I argue that today, with all of the peer to peer and digital means that we've talked about moving money, that I might use my legitimate paycheck to send a peer to peer payment to someone for something criminal, right? If you imagine that a lot of criminal acts, like especially if you look at things like drugs, these are things people are just doing between each other, right? Someone's sending somebody $40 and they get some cocaine or some crystal meth and then they go get high, right? That transaction might be a peer to peer transaction via electronic means, and there is no cash placement. So we need to make sure we're watching for behavioral trends as well as traditional cash controls. That's a soapbox. Listen to it. Okay, layering is that whole thing about breaking the paper trail or making it hard to tell what the source of that money was, right? The whole thing about money laundering is you can't launder clean money. The source has to be dirty, okay? It has to be an illicit source, a dirty source that then has to be cleaned. Why? Well, number one is the tax person, right? You have to pay taxes. Even the IRS expects people to pay taxes on ill-gotten gains. Criminal money is subject to taxation. You gotta love that they figured that out. Okay, so you move it around, you make it look like it came from legitimate business. Number one, that gives you an excuse for where the money came from. Number two, it breaks the trail, makes it hard to figure out where the money came from. And then number three, it actually hopefully helps you evade taxes. Hopefully, if you're a money launderer. Okay, and I want to impress upon each one of you that money launderers at this scale, criminals doing these things, are not the sweaty, dirty people in the alleys. These are people in suits and ties. These are people doing the third phase of integration, which is purchasing real estate, nice real estate, boats, nice boats, or reintegrating that money back into their business because this is a business. Drugs are a multi-billion-dollar business. Human trafficking, human smuggling, these are lucrative businesses. Crime pays, and it's our job to make sure it doesn't. but that's why people do it. So reframe in your mind the picture of who you're combating. This is a business person who has decided to take on an extremely risky, illegal, and hurtful business in order to profit extremely. They're willing to lose a little bit of money. They're willing to take a lot of risks. Reframe your opponent in your mind and be more successful. Now, complex. This is a very complex crime. It is a secondary crime. It is hard to explain to a jury what money laundering means. Believe me, I've been trying for years, and eventually I just go, yeah, it's fraud. Yeah, it's cybersecurity. Well, it's not. Okay, it involves cyber-enabled crimes, but it's a complex and fuzzy business like intelligence. Okay, intelligence professionals, or those of you who aspire to be intelligence and intelligence adjacent, know that this tradecraft requires thinking in indicators, challenging our beliefs, challenging what we see in front of us, understanding what's true, what's not, and looking behind and between the lines to know what it means. If you're looking for a shorter flash to bang, if you're looking for a crime and pinning it on somebody, that's fraud investigation, okay? But money laundering is actually, well, money laundering and tax evasion often share similar goals, and tax evasion is essentially often money laundering with clean money. So I said you can't launder clean money. That's because it's just tax evasion at that point. What it means is people who have a lot of money, people who win the lottery, people who get a big inheritance, people who make a ton of money and have it sitting there and they have to pay a lot of taxes because they end up with part of it in the high tax bracket. They just don't want to pay that. So the IRS actually specifically says it's fine to avoid taxes. It's fine to figure out legal shelters and ways to use your money that shields it from taxes and avoids taxes, but it's not okay to evade taxes, which is the criminal act. So tax evasion and money laundering share a goal: hide the money, break the paper trail. And by the way, when it comes to tax evasion, there is a nexus with other crime. If you're willing to break this law, what else are you willing to do in service of yourself? Remember that taxes are simply something that helps everyone. Hopefully roads, etc. Now we can disagree about where it's going, but the point is to be able to create a better place for us all to live. So, avoiding taxes, fine. Evading taxes, criminal. Let's not let it go any further. Certainly not to what we call terrorism. Now, terrorism sometimes is money laundering in reverse. Similar to tax evasion, it can be that legitimate funds are going to fund evil things. What do I mean by that? Well, let's think about the definition of terrorism. Terrorism is the use of violence, often indiscriminately, often not just against military targets, but against civilian targets as well, in order to instill fear and bring about ideological or political change. Now, we all agree that ideological and political change are things that sometimes need to happen, often need to happen, maybe constantly need to happen. But the point is that using violence to bring that about is something we don't do. I don't think it's okay, and therefore I'm against terrorism. Financing terrorism, though, is complicated because everyone's perspective is different. And so sometimes people think that it's necessary to do these things in order to free their country from someone who is oppressing them or a government that they don't like. And so one person's terrorist often becomes someone else's freedom fighter. And again, I encourage you as an intelligence professional, as someone who is learning to look for things, you have to reframe your perspective and understand how someone else can see such a thing as legitimate. Why? Because then you can understand the motivation, which helps you understand the capability, the methods, and the sources. So, money laundering in reverse. Sometimes legitimate things are going to go fund bullets and explosives to blow up people that don't deserve it. Crime is not far from that. You may think that if you're a terrorist, well, you've got this moral thing because it's religiously motivated. And actually, I get that. But the fact is, they don't care. If they're combating what they see as evil, they will use evil to do it. So they will sell drugs. The Assad regime in Syria was manufacturing methamphetamine-like drugs to distribute all over and destroy their enemies through chemical. It's essentially, it's like a form of chemical warfare to get people addicted to drugs. That's, fentanyl is similar. I'm about to get passionate about this thing. If you're willing to do awful things with violence, you're willing to do awful things with crime, kidnapping, extortion, methamphetamines, fentanyl, all of these things earn money to then go to fund violence. And that means that we can't always be looking for the same things. We need to develop new ways of thinking. We need to assess this as a sort of battlefield and use intelligence techniques and tactics in order to combat it. Relationships, groups, affiliations, ideologies, political nexuses, crime nexuses, alignments between criminal groups and terror groups, assessment of relationships is what really allows us to combat terrorism. So, moving on, we must remember that much of this is cyber enabled, and we cannot leave the cyber protective aspect of security out of this. Now, we see ourselves in different stovepipes, but if you truly take an intelligence mindset, it's important to bring fraud and cybersecurity, information security, and money security, money laundering, tax evasion, anti-terror financing. These are all seats at the same table. Fuse those capabilities together at some level in order to get a complete picture of what you're up against. Managing risk doesn't start with just trying to stamp out fires. It starts with fire prevention. And now, we're going to introduce the anti-financial crime workflow. That will be the final episode.